Imagine giving birth in a clearing, wrapped in the breath of damp earth, with the rustling oak leaves whispering like gossiping ghosts overhead. No warm bed, no boiling water, just a ring of women in wool soaked with dew, and a midwife, whose hair shimmered not from oil, but from the glint of a hidden blade. Welcome to ancient Celtic childbirth, equal parts survival, spiritual warfare, and social theatre. And if you think the knife was for cutting umbilical cords, oh, sweet listener, you're not even close. The Celtic tribes didn't separate medicine from magic, nor life from death. Their midwives, often elderly, childless women who'd long since bled out their own fertility, were considered walking thresholds. They moved between worlds like moths between firelight and shadow. You didn't just call a midwife for labour, you summoned her like a priestess, offering mead or hair or even blood. Her arrival meant more than just delivery. It meant your house had become a temporary altar, and she never came empty-handed. Under her wool cloak were dried herbs tied with gut string, sheep's fat, and a woven pouch filled with sharp teeth, human and otherwise. But the real secret was in her hair, long, thick braids coiled around her head like serpents, and woven inside a blade, iron or bronze depending on the century. It was curved like a smile, thin as a finger bone. You might ask, why not a belt or a sheath? But when your hands are soaked in birth blood and prayers, there's no time to reach for a belt. Your hair, however, is always with you. And if something went wrong, if the mother bled too fast or a spirit tried to claim the child, well, that knife was ready to make a different kind of cut. You're watching Hushed Historian, where truth whispers through time. If you enjoy what I dig up for you, subscribe so we don't lose our little historical connection. Thank you. Because here's the real trick. Celtic midwifery wasn't about medicine. It was about control. Control over bodies, blood and belief. The tribes feared gods and loved omens. They didn't trust luck. They carved it, bled it, birthed it. And when a child emerged twisted, blue or silent, the whispers started. Was it cursed? Was it the father's sin or the mother's? The midwife had to decide quickly. Perform the ritual or let nature take its vengeance. That's where the knife came in. Not always to save, but sometimes, brutally, to choose. If you think modern doctors face hard decisions, try doing it barefoot with a chanting grandmother watching and a dead raven on the threshold. Birth was considered a liminal state, a crack in the skin of the world. Spirits could slip through. The child might be a blessing or a changeling. And changelings, those sly, sickly creatures swapped by fairies, were feared more than wolves. A midwife might use her blade to prick the baby's foot, just enough to draw blood. If it cried normally, it was human. If it didn't, well, let's just say not every birth ended with a naming ceremony. But that wasn't even the worst part, because deep in the forested hills of what we now call Gaul and Ireland, certain births were timed to celestial events. Samhain, Beltane, the solstice, these weren't coincidences. Some women were chosen, either by prophecy, dreams, or convenient political necessity, to give birth during sacred alignments. The midwife's role? Less about health, more about sacrifice. Not always of the child, no. But maybe the placenta. Maybe an animal. Maybe something else. Remember, these were people who read the future in bones and named their sons after battle cries. The forest was their hospital, but also their cathedral. Trees witnessed more pain than priests, and moss soaked up screams long before pillows ever did. And still, the midwife stayed calm, always calm, her hair braided tight, her knife warm from body heat, her eyes already judging the weight of the soul she was pulling into the world. But something darker was coming. There was a word the Celts rarely said aloud, giasa. It meant a curse, a taboo, a sacred prohibition that once broken, brought ruin in the most poetic, soul-destroying ways. And sometimes, a woman would go into labour under a gias, knowingly or not. The midwife knew the signs. The air would feel colder, even by the fire. The breath of the trees would pause. And the animals, normally skittish during birth, would vanish completely. as if they knew better. When that happened, the knife in her braid wasn't just for the child or the cord. It was a warning to the spirit world. Not today. These Gyasa births were usually connected to blood debts, broken oaths, or ancestral crimes. One tale speaks of a chieftain's daughter, bound by a geas to bear no child under a full moon. Naturally, her labour began at moonrise. The midwife, an older woman with hair as white as milk fungus, arrived silent, holding a small jar of dog's tongue herb and a single stone painted with runes. She never removed her cloak. She never lit the fire. And when the baby crowned, she whispered a word no one else understood, then bit through the umbilical cord with her teeth. The child survived. The mother didn't. No one asked questions. The midwife left before dawn. Her footprints didn't frost over. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what happened to midwives themselves. You'd think being the lifeline between womb and world might earn you some respect. Think again. Celtic midwives were revered, yes, but also feared. It's one thing to help life emerge, it's another to be seen as the one who might hold life hostage. That line? Razor thin. Women who saved too many babies, especially ones with strange marks, extra fingers, webbed toes, were quietly accused of witchery. Worse, if a midwife failed and both mother and child died, the tribe demanded answers. Bad herbs, she might say. Wrong stars, she might shrug. But inside she knew. Sometimes the forest took its tax. This is where the knives became symbolic. They weren't just tools, they were insurance. A midwife with a blade in her braid could defend herself if the family turned violent. And yes, it happened. Not often, but enough that legends formed. One tale tells of a midwife who delivered a stillborn under the shadow of a black oak, only to have the father accuse her of stealing the baby's breath for herself. She pulled the blade from her hair and cut a line across her palm, showing her own blood was clean. He didn't believe her, he struck her. She stabbed him in the throat and vanished into the woods. They say she became a forest spirit, appearing only to pregnant women lost in storms. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, there were times when the midwife was also the executioner. You heard that right. Not all children were meant to live, especially not the ones born with signs. A veil over the face, teeth already in the gums, birthmarks shaped like birds or serpents. In some Celtic communities, these were omens of greatness or madness. The tribe would hold council. The druids might weigh in. But the final decision often fell to the midwife. She would carry the child to a sacred spring, wait for a sign, a bird, a ripple, a sudden wind, and then decide. Sometimes she returned with the baby. Sometimes she returned with empty arms and wet hair. The worst were the winter births. No food, no firewood, no medicine, a screaming mother, a breech baby, a hut full of frostbitten prayers, the midwife's hands raw, knuckles splitting. She had to make choices no one else could. Save the mother, save the child, save neither, and blame the gods. Either way, someone always cried. The father, the grandmother, the wind outside. Let's go back a bit. Before the blade, before the forest, before the woman ever became a midwife, there was an initiation. Not all women could do it, only those who had bled out a life or two of their own. Some had lost lovers, others, children. Some were simply born with that uncanny stillness, the kind that unsettles birds and makes flames flicker. They were taken into the woods by older midwives and taught the rites, which herbs stop bleeding, which ones start it. How to listen to a mother's breathing and know how many more were left, and how to braid a knife into your hair so tightly no one could take it unless they took your scalp too. Initiation wasn't some cosy sisterhood circle of flower crowns and tearful hugs. It was gristle and ritual and a scream swallowed before it could wake the forest. First, the older midwives would test your silence. You'd be sent into the woods alone at night, blindfolded, barefoot, and carrying a live coal in a horn cup. Your task? To find a birthing doe without spilling a spark or stepping on a twig. If you returned by dawn, they'd say you were touched by the ancestors. If you didn't return, well, they didn't count it as a failure. They called it natural selection. Survive that, and they'd cut your palm with a nettle-wrapped thorn. The blood was mixed with blackwort and smeared onto your eyelids. Then came the whispering, prayers, chants, sometimes curses, recited while your vision blurred into reds and shadows. It wasn't just symbolic, it was supposed to open you. Not just your body, but your senses. Make you hear the breath between heartbeats. Make you smell the fear before it curdled into pain. You weren't being trained to deliver life. You were being reforged into a vessel for it. If you think the knife was the scariest part, you clearly haven't met the spoon. Yes, the spoon. A flat iron ladle used for feeding broth, crushing herbs, and in the wrong hands, for scraping out stillborns. It was considered sacred. Midwives were buried with theirs, sometimes with the blade still braided into their skulls. But among the living, they rarely spoke of it. The spoon wasn't just a tool, it was a sentence. If you had to use it, that meant the gods had already turned away, that you'd failed or the stars had. Either way, someone would carry the shame. And it wasn't always the mother. But the blade, the blade was different. Its power wasn't in what it cut, but what it symbolized. Protection, decision, control. It whispered through generations. You do not touch the midwife unless you want to bleed. It also reminded everyone, men especially, that no matter how many warriors they trained, no matter how many deer they hunted, or how loudly they bragged at fire pits, none of them could bring life into the world like she could. And that power, it terrified them. And just when you think they respected her for it, let's talk about the trials. Every so often, a woman would miscarry, or a child would be born wrong. Too blue, too small, too dead. Or worse, alive but wrong. Twitching, quiet, smiling too early. And that's when the tribe would start to whisper. Maybe the midwife took something. Maybe she angered the gods. Maybe her blade had tasted the wrong kind of blood. Maybe she was too old, too clean, too powerful. They never accused her directly, not at first. It started with cold shoulders, refused offerings, children kept inside when she walked past. Then maybe a dead animal on her threshold, maybe a broken bowl. Then one night, they'd call a gathering. Not a trial, because that would imply justice. This was closer to a reckoning. The druids would arrive, the warriors would stand in a circle, and the midwife, she'd come braids tied high, blade shining, eyes sharp as flint. She knew what this was. Either they'd let her speak, or they wouldn't. Some fought, some didn't. Some spat curses that made wolves cry. One even laughed the whole way to the river, where they drowned her in the name of purity. And the next week, another woman went into labour, and another midwife came. Same braids, same blade, because for everyone they feared, another rose in her place. That's the irony. You couldn't burn them all. Not unless you wanted to birth your next heir in a ditch, screaming into the dirt with no one to catch the soul. Let's go deeper now. Because this wasn't just about knives or babies or fear. It was about belief, about the idea that women could hold death in one hand and salvation in the other, and not tremble, that they could bleed and weep and rage, and still be expected to fix what the gods broke, that they were holy until they weren't, revered until they outlived usefulness, worshipped until a man got nervous, and still they kept the blade, even when the village turned against them, even when men spat at their feet or called them corpse brides, even when children were warned not to look them in the eyes lest they catch some invisible rot of rebellion. Still, the blade stayed twisted into the braid like a defiant root refusing to rot. Because it wasn't just a weapon, it was a contract, a vow between the midwife and the bleeding truth of the world, that life doesn't come freely, and those who bring it forth must be sharp enough to cut for it. But that wasn't even the worst part. You see, there were births no midwife wanted to take, the cursed lineages, families with too much power and too little soul, chieftains with blood soaked not just from war, but from betrayals, wives silenced, daughters sold, sons born under eclipses. And when these men summoned a midwife, they expected silence, not healing, not honesty, silence, deliver the child, Say nothing about the mother's bruises. Say nothing about the missing twin. Say nothing about the fact that the cord was wrapped twice, tightly, like the gods tried to stop the baby from breathing, but the father insisted otherwise. These midwives had a name for it. The price of obedience. You could serve the tribe, or you could serve the truth. Never both. And yet, some tried. One story still hisses through old ash trees in Connaught. A midwife named Bray. She delivered a chieftain's 6th son, born with one green eye and one blind white orb, already opening and closing his hand, like he was counting something. The omens were clear. Cursed child. Marked soul. Bray refused to bless him. Said the mother was too weak, the child too strange, the stars too quiet. The chieftain threatened her. Offered silver. Then threatened again. She left at dawn. 3 nights later, his house burned. They found the child alive, unharmed. The mother gone. Bray too. All that remained was a braid of hair nailed to the doorframe, with the blade still shining inside. Some say she killed them both to spare the tribe. Others say she took the mother into the woods to heal, and left the baby behind on purpose. Whatever the truth, no midwife ever answered that chieftain's call again. His next heir was born on a rock, alone, and died within a day. Let's talk about the songs now. Yes, songs, because pain must have rhythm if it's to be survived. Celtic midwives didn't just moan and mutter, they sang. Low, guttural, winding sounds that moved through a woman's pelvis, like oil on gears. The lyrics changed with region and dialect, but the tone, always the same. Not lullabies, not hymns, something older. One song translated to break like bark and bloom like bone. Another meant the gate is red and the wind is watching. You want eerie? Picture a firelit hut in the woods, the air thick with blood, steam, and crushed mint, while an old woman sings about gates made of ribs and rivers of milk. The songs weren't just for the mother, they were for the others, spirits, ancestors, fae, whatever you want to call the shadows that linger when the veil thins and a new life is being pulled through it like a fish through netting. The songs warned them, not today. This soul is claimed. This child has hands waiting for it. Back away. And sometimes it worked, but sometimes the baby came out wrong. Not in body, in feel. Cold to the touch, even when screaming. Eyes too still, or worse, smiling before breath. Those were the changelings. The ones swapped at the last moment by something older than language. Some midwives raised them, others returned them to the woods, wrapped in moss and prayers. Either way, no one ever spoke of them again. The midwives carried that silence like another blade, and that silence, it cut deeper than any knife. You might think silence is passive, harmless, a gap in noise, but to a Celtic midwife, silence was an active force, sharper than screams, heavier than guilt, more lethal than most poisons in her pouch. When a woman died in childbirth, it was the midwife who stayed behind, wrapping the body in rough wool, closing the eyes with thumb and song. And when the father raged, because grief and guilt look a lot like fury in the dim light, she met it with silence. When the tribe whispered, because failure demands a scapegoat, she let their barbed words sink into her skin like burrs. But she never answered, because to speak might be to curse, or worse, to confess. And just when you think she was numb to it, immune, think again. There was one midwife, Mav, tall, stern, rumoured to have birthed over 200 children and buried only 9. She kept a bone charm around her neck, carved from a child's rib. They said it hummed when someone lied. One winter, a chieftain's daughter died giving birth to twins. One lived, one didn't. The father demanded to see both. Mav said the dead one was taken by the gods. He didn't believe her. Dug up the grave, found nothing. He accused her of hiding the body. Or worse, witchcraft. The druids convened. The people gathered. Mav arrived with her braid coiled higher than usual. No blade visible, but everyone knew. She stood silent as accusations piled like snow. When asked to defend herself, she raised one hand, opened her palm, marked with 9 lines, one for each soul lost. Then she bit her own finger, smeared blood across the lines, and turned to leave. No words, just silence thick enough to choke. No one followed. Weeks later, the chieftain's only surviving child, one of the twins, wandered into the forest and was found dead by a standing stone. No wounds, just wide, terrified eyes and a mouth full of moss. After that, the people stopped questioning Mav. If you think that's where the fear ended, oh no, because the deeper terror was never in the blood. It was in the knowing. Midwives saw everything. Who bled too early, who faked miscarriages to avoid alliances, who came to them at night, clutching herbs and begging for discretion. They held secrets like they held newborns, tight, trembling, warm with consequence. That's why the knife in the braid wasn't just for spirits or screaming labour pains. It was protection, against those who might want to silence her. There were stories, of course. A young midwife, only 17 winters, accused of poisoning a noblewoman's child. She was tied to a post, blade cut from her hair, arms bound. She said nothing as the tribe judged her. But that night, before they could burn her, the village dogs went mad. Barking, howling, snarling at nothing. At dawn, the midwife was gone. The post was snapped in half, and every chicken in the village lay a blood-speckled egg for 7 days. Coincidence? Maybe. But no one raised a hand against a midwife after that. Let's go back a bit, because this blade, the one in the braid, wasn't just practical, it was ceremonial. Before a midwife could carry it, it had to be blessed. Not by priests or druids, by the dead. A night spent in a barrow, sleeping beside bones, wrapped in linen once soaked in afterbirth. The blade was placed on the chest of a skull and left until the moss grew over the hilt. Only then could it be woven into hair and blood and breath. Only then could it choose. That's right, choose, because not every blade stayed. Some rusted within days, some vanished entirely, some made the bearer bleed just by being touched. The ones that stayed, they had stories, they had names, and they were never passed down. They stayed with the woman until her final breath, then buried with her mouth sewn shut, and her hands folded in prayer or defiance, depending on how she died. And still, the forest whispered. It whispered the names of midwives long dead, whose bones had crumbled under mossy cairns, but whose stories kept crawling through time, like roots hunting for water. Every glen, every stone circle, every ash-darkened birthing floor held memories and warnings, especially about the ones who crossed the line. Because for all their sacred status, midwives weren't saints, they were human, which meant they bled, broke, and sometimes broke others. This is where the story twists. There was a midwife once, Alice they called her. Hair black as pitch, voice soft as crushed sage. She knew too much, they said. Birthed too many, with the call intact. Kept too many from death's grip. Some whispered she fed the gods behind closed doors. Others swore they saw her walking backwards at dusk, humming to stones. But what made Alice infamous wasn't her skill. It was her betrayal. She was asked to deliver the baby of a warrior's wife. The woman, young and terrified, had laboured 3 days under a sky that refused to change colour. Stormless, sunless, just a grey mouth stretched wide across the heavens. Alice arrived late, too late. The child was stillborn, the mother dying, and Alice, with shaking hands, did something no midwife should. She used the blade, not to cut, not to end, but to call. They say she carved a spiral into the blood-slick earth and whispered something in a tongue too old to name. The air went sour. The trees leaned in, and then for a moment, the baby cried. But it wasn't a baby anymore, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the mother's body jerked once and stilled. The child opened its eyes, pitch black without whites or lashes. It didn't scream. It laughed. A small broken wheeze that turned the marrow cold. Alice swaddled it and vanished. Left the house, the village, the name. Never seen again. But sometimes when the fog thickens in certain moors, people hear it. That laugh. Small, wrong, echoing. What happened to the child? No one agrees. Some say it became a seer, blind and mad. Others think it's still out there, growing slower than time. But one thing is certain. After Alis, every midwife's blade was double-checked. Not just for sharpness, for loyalty. Because here's the truth no one likes. A blade remembers. The ones passed from hand to hand, quietly, in secret, weren't just tools. They were witnesses. They'd sliced flesh, cut fate, defended against both man and monster. But sometimes, just sometimes, they whispered back. Tiny sounds in the dead of night, echoes of cries long buried, a tickle in the braid, a shiver on the scalp, and the midwife would know, something's watching. Let's go deeper, into the caves. Yes, caves, hidden chambers beneath the hills, where some midwives trained in absolute darkness. No light, no fire, only the wet breath of stone and the pulse of their own fear. They would sit for hours, sometimes days, with only a bowl of cold water and a bundle of dried nettle to chew. They learned to recognize pain by its scent, despair by the taste in the air, hope by the sound it made when it died. And when they emerged, blinking and hollow-eyed, they were reborn. Not everyone made it out. Some caves kept their secrets. Some blades were left behind, wedged into cracks, rusting in silence, waiting. And every so often, a child would stumble across one. A blade too thin for hunting, too short for war, too sacred to be touched. But they touched it anyway. And later, when someone went into labour nearby, that child would be the first to run, first to hear, first to see, and eventually, the one who heard the whisper. You're next. That whisper wasn't a choice, it was a summoning. You didn't apply to become a Celtic midwife like it was some woodland internship. You were chosen by fate, by blood, by a blade that once tasted your skin and didn't flinch. And once the whisper came, there was no turning back. The forest had marked you. The silence had weighed your breath. The spirits had licked your name clean of innocence. Most didn't tell anyone. What was there to say? A knife hidden in a dead woman's braid whispered at me. That kind of talk got you locked in a root cellar or married off to the first goat farmer with a strong back and no imagination. So they kept it secret. But it started showing anyway. In the way they stopped laughing. In the way they touched wood when someone coughed. In the way they walked slower past the birthing hut, as if waiting for something to pull them inside. And when it did, when the blood finally called, everything changed. Let's talk about the first cut. Every midwife remembered hers, not the ceremonial kind, the real one. The first time a woman bled too much and the blade had to be used, not gently, but like a butcher carving hope out of failure. Sometimes it was to cut the perineum when the baby was stuck. Sometimes it was to sever the cord from a child already blue. And sometimes it was to end the suffering. Yes, end it. They never talked about those. The first cut left a mark, not on the body, but the soul. That's when the knife in the braid stopped being a symbol and became a burden. A secret coiled into every lock of hair. You could always spot a midwife who had made the first cut. She carried herself differently. Not hunched, no. Upright, defiant, but quieter. Like someone listening to things you couldn't hear, and just when you think that silence made them holy, it also made them dangerous. Because the knife didn't just stay in the braid. It crept into the stories, the lullabies, the threats whispered to disobedient children. Keep crying and the midwife will come cut your shadow. Lie to me, and I'll send for the woman with the hair blade. That fear, it grew, twisted. By the time Roman scribes encountered Celtic tribes and tried to document their customs, they didn't know what to make of these women. Warriors who didn't fight, healers who let people die, matrons with metal in their hair and blood on their palms. They wrote them off as witches, but witches beg for power. Midwives already had it, and they didn't need curses, just a scream, a knife, and the kind of focus that turns gods into rumours. Let's go back to the hearth now, because not every birth happened in the woods or caves. Many were in homes, damp huts with low ceilings, peat fires, the stink of animal fat and old milk. The birthing stool would be pulled close to the fire. Women would gather with steaming cloths, nettle tea, and prayer song. And in the middle of it all, the midwife, not shouting, not directing, just watching, waiting, listening to the rhythm of agony and breath, knowing exactly when to step in and when to let the mother scream through it. Because sometimes pain was the only passageway left. The blade wouldn't even be touched, just felt, like a promise coiled at the nape of her neck. And that was enough to keep everyone in line. Because even in the most sacred moments of new life, fear hovered. What if something went wrong? What if the baby came too early? What if the cord wrapped or the mother tore or the cry never came? That's when the midwife would move, swift, clean, efficient. She'd pull the knife from her braid like a god plucking lightning from her skull and do what had to be done. Then she'd tuck it back into her hair and return to silence. But silence isn't the same as peace, no. Peace implies rest and end. Silence for the Celtic midwife was just a pause between screams, between chants, between life clawing its way into the world and death waiting politely at the threshold. She lived in those in-betweens, in breathless huts and in blood-slick moss, in cries cut short and in lullabies never finished. And when the fire crackled low and the baby was finally sleeping, she'd sit, alone, hair still braided, blade still warm, listening, always listening, because sometimes the cries came back. You don't forget them. Not really. The first cry of a healthy child is seared into your bones like lightning. But so is the sound of a stillborn's final gurgle. The way a mother's scream cuts off mid-labour when the bleeding becomes too much. The crunch of bone when a shoulder has to be broken to save a breech baby. These sounds, they haunt, not like ghosts, but like memories with claws. And just when you think she's done counting those scars, the real ones are deeper. You see, some midwives made marks, not on their skin, on the walls, a slash for each birth survived, a circle for every mother lost, a spiral for each changeling born. One by one, they'd carve them into the beams, above their beds, or the underside of a birthing stool. Not to remember, to forget, to trap the horror outside themselves, keep it etched in wood instead of buried in blood. But something darker was coming. It began with silence, not the practiced kind, but the unnatural one. Birds stopped singing, dogs stopped barking, even the firewood refused to crackle, a hush so thick it made ears ring. That's when the midwife knew. The veil between worlds was thinning, and something hungry was sniffing around. Not a spirit, not a god, something older. The Celts had a name for it, though they rarely said it aloud. Deargas. It wasn't a creature, it was a presence, a corruption. It crept into births where blood had been spilled too early, where women had screamed too long, where the child's eyes didn't blink. Derga wasn't seen. It was felt, like mould under skin, like a scream held in the teeth. If it came, the midwife had one task: end the birth, end the life, bury the blades so deep into something, flesh, soil, fate, that the stain wouldn't spread. There's a tale about that. Of course there is. A winter birth in a snow-packed hut, no windows, just a single lantern, and a woman labouring under a pelt. The midwife, young, unsure, heard the silence first, then saw the fire gutter blue. She reached for her blade. It tangled in her braid, wouldn't come loose. And that's when she felt it, cold breath on the back of her neck. She didn't turn around. She just whispered a prayer and bit down on the braid itself, snapping the cord that held the knife. She stabbed without looking, hit nothing, but the silence broke. The baby was still born. The mother survived. And when the midwife tried to speak, she couldn't. Her voice was gone. Not from fear, not from injury, taken. The Derga had claimed a price. She never spoke again. But she kept midwifing in absolute silence, and oddly, more babies lived when she delivered. Some said it was the Derga protecting her. Others said it was guilt made holy. Let's go back a bit, because all this fear, this reverence, this silence, it came from one truth. The midwife was not there to bring joy. She was there to ensure consequence. Birth, for the Celts, was a transaction. Blood in, breath out, pain in, soul out. And the midwife? She was the ledger, the one who tallied every cry, every death, every wrong star. That's why the blade stayed. Not for the baby, not even for the mother, for the balance. And balance was not gentle. It wasn't about fairness or justice, at least not in the way we like to romanticize. In the Celtic world, balance meant everything had a price. A living child meant a sleepless night. A healthy mother meant a debt to the gods. Even a painless birth, rare, suspicious, meant the midwife would bleed somewhere else. Maybe that night, maybe a week later. A cut on her hand that wouldn't clot. A dream that left her sobbing and unable to explain why. Because balance always collects. The midwife wasn't just the hand that caught the baby. She was the hand that pushed back against chaos. Every scream she heard was a potential omen. Every tear she wiped could water a curse. So when she reached for her blade, it wasn't panic. It was precision. Not rage, ritual. The blade wasn't just to cut. It was to remind every spirit, every lurking thing in that space. She was watching too. If you think she did it all for the love of her people, you haven't been listening. Some midwives were feared because they wanted to be. They cultivated silence like a crop. They let the rumours grow wild. Witch, shadow, blood singer. Not to hurt people, but to protect themselves. Power doesn't survive long in a world that can't define it. So they leaned into mystery, wore talismans that meant nothing, painted symbols on their doors they didn't believe in, let the tribe think they were divine, because divinity frightens more effectively than truth. And just when it couldn't get more twisted, there were the cleansings. Sometimes, after a string of deaths, too many stillbirths, too many mothers buried with their legs still stained, tribes turned inward. Suspicion spread like mildew. The gods are angry, they'd say. Or worse, the midwife has drawn something in. And then came the ritual. Not against her, no, never directly. That would be too obvious, too risky. Instead they'd purify the birthing hut, burn herbs, wash the walls in fermented milk, cut the legs off the birthing stool, and carve new ones. All symbolic, all pointed, all meant to say, we don't trust you anymore. Some midwives left after that, walked into the forest and didn't come back. Others stayed, stared the tribe down, went right back to catching babies with hands as steady as stone. One even carved a blade into the new stool leg. No one mentioned it, but they saw. And let's not forget, these women had no heirs, no daughters of their own. Most had lost children early, or bled too much to risk more. Some were barren by choice, others by curse. One rumour said a midwife who bore her own child would go mad, unable to choose who to save. No one wanted to test it. So how were new midwives made? Simple. They were called, marked, tested, not by schools or mentors, but by the world itself. A girl finds a bloodied birthing cloth and doesn't cry. A child wakes from a dream, holding a name she's never heard. And later, that woman dies in childbirth. A girl touches an old midwife's blade, and it doesn't cut her. That was enough. And from there, the training wasn't tender. The older midwives didn't coddle. They didn't explain. They watched, threw the girl into birthrooms and told her to observe. If she fainted, she was fed broth and told to return. If she wept, she was told to hide it. And if she asked too many questions, she was handed the blade and told, decide for yourself. Let's go back to that phrase, decide for yourself. It haunted every Celtic midwife, because the blade wasn't magic. It didn't know right from wrong. It only obeyed the hand that wielded it. And that hand had to choose, cut or not, save or don't, silence or scream. No gods, no counsel. Just blood and breath, and the terrifying weight of consequence wrapped in hair. And hair wasn't just an accessory, it was a ledger. Each braid a tally of births, each twist a thread of memory. Midwives didn't cut their hair unless they had failed so profoundly that the blade lost trust in them. When that happened, and it did, they'd unbraid it, strand by strand, weeping into the hearth ashes. Then they'd take the blade, heat it red in flame, and bury it at the threshold of the last house where a baby had died. A silent apology, a surrender, A curse. Hair, like memory, was meant to grow heavy. And this is where the story starts to burn. Not metaphorically, literally. Because when Christianity began its slow smothering crawl across Celtic lands, it brought fire. Holy fire, cleansing fire. But also the kind of fire that doesn't ask questions. You know what the early priests feared more than druids? Midwives. Not just because they controlled birth, but because they didn't fear death. Because their knowledge came not from books but from blood. And because their blades had never bowed. The church called it heresy, called the songs devilish, called the herbs poison, called the silence blasphemy. But they were most afraid of the knives, not the steel, but the idea that a woman could walk into the darkest moment of someone's life, pull life or death from her braid, and not ask permission. That terrified them more than any altar ever could. And just when you think the midwives resisted with fire of their own, most didn't. They went quiet. They watched their sacred grounds become chapels. They watched their birthing stools burned. They watched the blade become a relic, a curiosity, something to be confiscated. They pretended to bless babies in the name of saints. They hummed their old songs under their breath while pretending to pray. They traded mead for wine, wool for linen, forest shrines for whitewashed stone. But the blade stayed, hidden now, not in hair but under floorboards, in locked boxes, in amulets made to look harmless. One midwife even wore hers as a hairpin, carved to resemble a cross. When asked about it, she'd smile and say, "For parting the hair during blessings." No one ever dared check. And still, they kept delivering. Because babies didn't care who ruled the land. They came when they were ready, storm or sermon be damned. And the midwives? They kept answering, even when the punishments grew, even when women were dragged from their homes and accused of hexing livestock or drying herbs on the wrong day, even when a blade was found and labelled a witch's talon, even when one was forced to confess under torture, spitting blood and prayers in equal measure, they kept showing up to births, because they knew something the priest didn't. You can scare a midwife, you can silence her, but you can't unmake what she's seen. Let's go back to that blade. By this time, it was more myth than metal. The new generation, raised on scripture and shame, thought it was superstition. That the idea of a knife hidden in hair was just a story told by trembling old women to make themselves sound important. They didn't understand that it was never about fear. It was about readiness, about being prepared to meet the worst moment of someone's life, and not flinch. One girl learned that too late. She trained without the blade, believed she didn't need it. First birth she attended, things went wrong fast. The cord was tight, the baby wouldn't turn. The mother was slipping, and all she had were herbs, cloth, and a prayer she didn't believe in. She screamed for help. No one came. The mother died. The baby, barely alive, wouldn't stop shaking. When the elder midwife arrived, she didn't scold. She didn't speak. She just handed the girl a blade, thin, curved, warm from her braid. The girl never went to a birth without it again. But the blade was never just an object. It was a ritual, a test, a transformation, pressed into metal. Holding it meant stepping into a different version of yourself, one where hesitation could kill, and mercy sometimes looked like cutting. And for that girl, like so many before her, the blade wasn't just comfort. It was a confession. She wasn't who she thought she was. She wasn't just a healer, or a helper, or a woman learning an old trade. She was something harder, something older, something that bled when others screamed, but stayed standing. And just when she thought she understood what the blade meant, she learned what it cost. Her second birth went worse than the first. Not because she was unprepared. She had the blade, she had the chance, she had the calm. But this time, the baby came early. Too early. The skin was thin as parchment. The lungs barely stirred. The mother looked up with bloodshot eyes and whispered, "Will she live?" And the midwife, this girl still not a woman, had to choose whether to lie. She didn't. The mother died that night. Not from blood loss, from heartbreak. And the midwife realised something deeper than any chance could teach. The blade doesn't always cut the flesh. Sometimes it cuts the future. That's when she stopped singing. Let's talk about the songs. The older midwives used to sing through every birth. Not for the baby, not even for the mother. For themselves. A way to stay tethered, to keep the mind from slipping while the body works like an animal. But the girl, now growing into the legend of her role, stopped. Her voice caught. She hummed sometimes, low, like a dying fire, but she never sang. And the women noticed. They whispered that maybe she was cursed, that maybe she was marked, and maybe she was. Because one day, she walked into a birth where the father waited outside with a knife of his own. Not ritual, not sacred, just sharp, just angry. His last wife had died in childbirth. So had the one before that. This third woman, barely past her first moonblood, was screaming too early, and no one dared help. But the midwife walked in. She didn't flinch. The father barked that if the child died, she'd follow. The midwife said nothing, just took off her cloak, braided her hair tighter, tucked the blade into the knot, and began. The baby was breech. The girl was torn. There was too much blood, too much silence, too much of that feeling that something was watching from the corner of the hut. And yet, she pulled the baby out, alive, barely. The mother, she lived too. The father didn't thank her. He didn't speak, just left. But the next day he returned. Not with thanks, with a coin. And a warning, don't ever come back. She didn't. But 3 years later, when the child grew sick, guess who they called? Let's go back a bit, because midwifery wasn't just about catching babies and surviving angry men. It was also about knowing things, the kind of things books don't teach and prayers don't touch. How to bind a wound with spider silk. How to coax a breech baby by whispering to its bones. How to test if a child has breath left, using only the back of your hand. How to hear a death before it enters the room. The midwife knew those things, and more. She knew when the river meant fever, when the wind meant twins, when a crow on the roof meant the baby wouldn't cry. So when she walked into a home, blade in her braid, hands calloused, face still, everyone understood. This wasn't medicine. This was war. And she was the soldier nobody thanked. Because that's the thing about midwives, especially Celtic ones. They weren't remembered like saints. No glowing halos, no poetic last words. Just blood-stained linen, weary hands, and whispers. Always whispers. Even those they saved spoke about them like shadows. With caution, with awe, sometimes with fear. And that suited them just fine. Because they weren't in it for gratitude. They were in it for the reckoning. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came after the birth, after the cries, after the chanting, the boiling of cloths, the settling of mothers into sleep. That's when the silence turned sour. That's when the real work began. Watching, waiting, making sure nothing followed the baby out. Because in Celtic belief, birth wasn't just about bodies, it was about passage. And not all who tried to pass belonged. There were stories, so many stories, of babies who never blinked. Who watched everyone with two still eyes. Who stopped crying too soon. One child was born laughing. Another came out with teeth. And every time, the midwife had to decide. Mark them as touched or remove them. No one said it, but everyone knew what that meant. The blade made that choice. It was in these moments, softer than screams, more chilling than blood, that the midwife became something else entirely. A judge, a barrier, a last line between the world of the living and whatever waited beyond. She might not say a word, might just hum a tune no one recognised, but her hand would hover near the braid, near the knife, near the balance, and just when you think no one noticed, they always noticed. One grandmother once refused to let a midwife bless her grandson. Not after what she did, she whispered, but no one knew what she meant, the mother insisted. The blessing happened, and 3 nights later, the child vanished from his cradle. In his place, a rock wrapped in wool. The family wailed. The midwife said nothing, but someone saw her in the woods days later, planting something under a hawthorn tree. A bundle, a charm, a warning. Let's talk about the charms now. Midwives weren't just deliverers, they were guardians of wombs, of souls, of secrets. So they carried charms, woven reeds, dried teeth, carved bones, crow feathers. Each had a purpose, some to call life, some to ward death, some to keep others out. And by others, we mean exactly what you think. Fae, spirits, echoes of ancestors who never left quietly. A midwife once wore a necklace of mouse skulls, one for every child she saved from a fever. She said they squeaked the death away. Were they superstitious? Maybe. But would you gamble a newborn's breath on reason? Let's go deeper. To the oath. Yes, the midwives had one. Not written, not spoken, breathed. Given in silence at the foot of a birthbed where no baby came. That was the right. To sit with a death, infant, mother both, and say nothing. No cries, no prayers, just sit. Until the soul passed. Until the room cooled. Until the blade cooled. Then and only then did the oath take hold. I see you. I carry you. I protect what enters, and I guard what leaves. No one heard it, but every midwife knew it. It lived in the blade, it lived in the braid, and it lived in the way their eyes never looked away from pain. But something darker was coming. A midwife once kept a journal. Not words, symbols, 1 page per birth, spirals, knots, inked with her own blood. She called it her silent ledger. When she died, they burned it. Not because it was cursed, because it wasn't. It was honest, too honest, showed the weight of every life taken and spared, showed who had been marked, showed who hadn't been. And that kind of honesty, it was more dangerous than magic, especially when wielded by a woman. That was the real blasphemy, wasn't it? Not the blade, not the herbs, not even the songs hummed in languages older than Latin. It was the power, the sight of a woman standing in a room while blood poured, while death circled and refusing to look away. Not weeping, not begging, just choosing, calmly, unflinchingly. That's what made people call them witches. That's what made men sharpen their fear into accusation. And just when it couldn't get more ironic, the same men would come begging later, quietly, always at night, when their wives were burning with fever, or when their newborns had gone limp, or when the priest's prayers did nothing. Then and only then, the midwife was sacred again. Until dawn, until things were better. Then she became something else, unholy, inconvenient, a walking reminder that not all power wore a robe, but she didn't care. Because by then, she knew something most people couldn't bear to face. The line between life and death wasn't a wall. It was a thread, frayed, slippery, wrapped around her fingers, knotted into her braid, whispering through her blade like breath. Let's talk about that whisper. There are tales, always whispered, always denied, of midwives who started hearing it outside of births, in the woods, by rivers, in their sleep. A voice like wind on old stone, soft, persuasive, asking questions. Would you rather save the mother or the child? Would you trade one life for two? Would you use the blade for something more? And some said yes. That's where the split happened. Midwives who kept the blade sacred, and those who let the blade choose its own hunger. The first group stayed near hearths, the second went into the woods, became something else. Not quite witches, not quite druids, something in between. They learned how to call storms, how to curse a name into soil, how to see the death in someone's eyes before it came. And eventually, people stopped calling them midwives. They were cutters. They no longer delivered life, they managed fate, became legends in their own right, feared, hunted, but never forgotten. There was one, the cutter of Caer Bronach, who was said to carry 3 blades in her hair, one for birth, one for death, and one for the in-between. She wore her braid across her chest like a sash, and when she walked through a village, pregnant women hid, and fathers crossed themselves, because wherever she went, someone stopped breathing. Let's go back to the others, the ones who stayed. They kept the old ways, taught the new girls how to listen, not just act, how to hum the blood away from a broken womb, how to test for soul sickness by the taste of a newborn skin, how to bury the afterbirth under the right moon, or risk the child growing up twisted by hunger and rage. They didn't seek worship. They didn't want praise. They just wanted the blade to keep working, to keep meaning something. But then came the church's reform. Midwives were ordered to register, to be trained by men, to use approved tools, to abandon charms, to cut their hair. And here is where it all fractured. Some complied, cut their braids, burned their blades, learned Latin names for herbs they used to speak to. They wore white. They prayed before deliveries. They stopped humming. They smiled. And they lost more babies than ever before. But others, they went underground, formed covens that weren't really covens, just groups of old women and the young ones brave enough to learn from them. They taught in secret, carried their blades in shawls instead of hair, hummed softly while pretending to cough, and in the silence between births, they passed down stories, not written, not recorded, just told, over steaming bowls of nettle broth, over cries, over graves, because they knew something would try to erase them. And they also knew it would fail, because truth doesn't need parchment. It doesn't crumble under doctrine or disappear beneath clean robes and tidy altars. Truth lives where blood stains the floor, and no one speaks of it afterward. Truth lives in the crack of a bone, in the whimper of a newborn, not yet sure it wants to be here. It lives in the midwife's braid, where the blade still sleeps, dormant but not gone. You can outlaw a tool, you can ban a song, but you cannot unteach a knowing. Let's talk about that knowing, the kind that pulses in the fingertips when a womb is about to rupture, the kind that smells a fever coming before the sweat even beads, the kind that feels the wind shift when a spirit comes looking for a soul that hasn't been claimed yet. It's not logic, it's not science, it's instinct, shaped by centuries of screaming, praying, cutting and surviving. That's what the church could never touch, because knowing isn't hers to rewrite. And just when you think the blade stayed buried forever, one surfaced. It was found in a peat bog, wrapped in cloth beside the mummified body of a woman whose hands were folded over her stomach, not her chest, a sign of someone who died giving life, or trying to. Her braid had mostly disintegrated, but the pattern remained etched into the skull, grooves where the plait had been wound so tight it left a memory in bone. The blade was iron, curved, decorated with knotwork too fine to be ornamental, a tool of meaning, a weapon of mercy. The archaeologists cleaned it, displayed it, called it a ritual object, as if ritual were separate from survival, as if this woman hadn't wielded it with real bleeding purpose. They never found her name. But somewhere, a midwife's descendant felt something stir, a dream, a pressure in the spine, a whisper in the braid. You remember. Let's go back a bit, because remembering wasn't a choice, it was a condition of the role. Midwives weren't allowed to forget, not the births, not the deaths, not the in-between moments when neither seemed likely. They carried every life they touched like invisible stones sewn into the hem of their cloaks, too heavy to speak of, too sacred to drop. There was an old practice, long gone now, where midwives carved tiny lines into a birch branch after every delivery. Notches, simple, brutal. A single branch might bear hundreds. When the branch was full, they'd burn it. The ashes were mixed with water and poured into the roots of trees. Those trees, they said, became watchers. Birth trees, marked by pain, honoured by silence. But pain, like trees, grows in rings. Generations passed, the blades grew rarer, the stories fainter. But in some places, the ones the map makers still mark in cursive and fog, girls still braid their hair on storm nights, still tuck charms under their pillows, still listen for the whisper when a birth cry splits the sky. And those girls? They're not just playing, they're remembering, because the blade was never just for cutting, it was for choosing to stay, to help, to risk everything so another breath could enter this world. It was a promise. And though the names have changed, nurse, doula, obstetrician, the weight hasn't. Not really. It still coils in the spine, still sharpens the hand, still presses against the scalp in moments of doubt. The modern world forgets that sometimes, wraps birth in sterile sheets and fluorescent light, talks of due dates and dilation charts like it's clockwork, not alchemy. But in the space between contractions, between pushes, between that final silence and the first scream, something older waits. And sometimes it reaches out, a tug in the braid, a hum in the ear, a sense illogical and absolute that now is the time to act, that you are alone in this room with death, and death will blink first, that you carry a blade even if no one sees it, especially if no one sees it, because the most dangerous blade is the one you forget is there, not because it's hidden, but because you've convinced yourself it's no longer needed. That's how you lose whole legacies, one forgotten cut at a time. And the Celtic midwife's blade? It wasn't forged for battle, it was forged for truth. And truth doesn't rust, it waits, it listens. It remembers how you once trembled at the edge of death and dared to pull someone back. Let's talk about what happened after the birth. Not the celebrations, not the cooing, not the father weeping from shock or the grandmother whispering thank you prayers. No, the quiet after. The eerie pregnant pause when the mother sleeps and the baby nestles and everyone else finally exhales. That's when the midwife would stand alone, her hands still sticky, her braid damp with sweat, her blade slick, warm, coiled with ghostly heat, and that's when the testing began. Not of her skill, of her soul. You see, birth didn't just take blood, it took certainty, and each time a sliver of it disappeared. Where did the spirit really come from? Why did some babies scream like they were mourning something they'd already lost? Why did some mothers refuse to look at their child, as if sensing something wrong, something not entirely human? The midwife had no time for answers, only instincts, and one instinct ruled above all: protect the threshold. Because that's what she was, not just a healer, a threshold, between life and death, body and soul, human and not. And thresholds attract wanderers, especially the kind that never fully left, spirits, echoes, malice that wore innocence like skin. And just when you think that's myth, a midwife once told this story. Or rather, she whispered it to a girl who would later become one herself. It was about a child born without a shadow, not missing, refusing. In every firelight, in every lantern's glow, the crib cast one shadow, but the baby didn't. The parents didn't notice, but the midwife did. She said nothing, just braided her hair tighter, slept by the hearth with her blade in her braid, and waited. On the third night, something came to collect what hadn't been given. It came in the form of smoke, moved like it had memory. No eyes, no sound, just cold. So much cold the baby stopped breathing, as if the room had no air left. The midwife didn't scream. She didn't pray. She cut the air, literally, pulled her blade and slashed the space above the cradle. The smoke screamed without sound. The baby gasped. The fire flared. And then it was morning. No one spoke of it. The parents never knew. But the midwife, she added a new charm to her braid that day. A tiny knot of scorched wool. Not to show off, to warn, to tell the others, we don't just catch babies, we guard the door. Let's go back to the blade itself. Because it wasn't just iron, it was intention. Every midwife forged or inherited hers. And before it ever touched flesh, it touched belief. Dipped in salt water and sweat. Passed through smoke from the sacred yew. Pressed against the tongue. Speak only when necessary, they'd say, then across the womb. Cut only when fate forgets the path. Finally, to the braid. Carry what others cannot. It didn't glitter. It didn't shine. It listened. And that's why they never gave their blades away. Not even at death. They buried them deep, wrapped in cloth, kissed with breath, hidden in places only birds could find. One midwife buried hers in a hollow tree struck by lightning. Another in the ribs of a whale washed up in a storm. One tied hers to her thigh bone and was cremated with it, ashes and edge, bound forever, because to pass it on the wrong way was to invite ruin. You couldn't just hold the blade, you had to deserve it, and that was the paradox. The blade, as sacred as it was feared, had no use for pride, no room for vanity. It didn't care how many births you'd attended or how many names you'd earned. It cared whether your hands shook when they shouldn't, whether your voice broke when silence was needed, whether you were willing to cut when kindness failed. The blade didn't forgive, but it remembered. And so did the women who wore it. One girl tried to fake it. She braided a kitchen knife into her hair and called herself midwife, learned a few herbs, mimicked the chants, told the stories with her chin lifted like a performer, not a priestess. And it worked, for a while, until the night a mother tore, bled too fast, and the girl, too frightened, too slow, froze. The baby lived. The mother didn't. And the next morning, when she tried to braid the blade back in, it wouldn't stay. The hair unravelled again and again. Even the birds wouldn't come near her. The elders said nothing. They didn't need to. Let's talk about how a blade rejects its bearer. It starts small, slips from the braid too often, refuses to cut cleanly. The edge dulls without reason. Then the whispers begin. Not voices, reminders of births gone wrong, of screams unanswered, of the weight of indecision. If ignored, the blade takes more. A tremor in the fingers, a blindness in the moonlight. One midwife's reflection stopped appearing in still water. She couldn't draw her own breath without gasping. She buried her blade that winter, and never took another. Because once the blade loses faith, you either leave or you burn. And just when you think that sounds dramatic, there was the night of soot, a fire that ripped through 3 villages, consuming every known midwife's hut. No other homes touched, no livestock lost, just the birthing rooms, just the stools, the herbs, the sacred tools. The people said it was lightning. The survivors knew better. It was a warning. From the cutters? From the gods? No one could say. But after that night, no one claimed to be a midwife unless she had proof. And not just the blade, the cut. A ritual every new midwife endured. One that left a line along the ribs, hidden from the world, but known to those who mattered. It wasn't deep, just enough to scar, just enough to remember. Just enough that when the blade finally chose her, it recognised the pain. Because nothing worth carrying ever comes without blood. Let's go deeper. There's a word in Old Celt, I'm Duain. It translates poorly as soul skin. Midwives believed everyone was born with it, a thin membrane between the spirit and the world. Newborns had it intact, fragile, pure, but it tore with each sorrow, each grief. And midwives? Theirs were tattered from the start, ripped open from all the pain they held that wasn't theirs. And still they stood, still they braided, still they bled. One old midwife once said, "My soul skin's like a fisher net, full of holes and too stubborn to sink." They laughed, but it wasn't a joke, because that's what kept the blade sharp, the weight of the holes. Let's go back to the hair. It wasn't fashion, it was armour, each braid tight as binding, each twist a ward. Midwives never wore their hair down, except at death. To unbraid was to surrender, to release what you'd carried, and to let the blade rest. It was the last rite. One village buried their midwife with her braid still coiled. No one dared unbind it. They said she hadn't finished her work, that a birth was still owed. And one spring, a woman gave birth in the fields, no midwife near. The baby came clean, strong, and with a line across his chest, curved, pale, blade-shaped. No one spoke of it, but they all visited her grave, because some debts don't expire, some threads don't unravel, and some blades keep working long after the hand that held them has turned to dust. It was whispered that her spirit finished the work herself, that the blade in her grave spun like a compass when the time came, cutting through the veil just enough for one more breath to slip through. No ceremony, no chant. Just steel memory doing what it was forged to do, protect the threshold. Let's talk about those graves. Midwives weren't buried with the others. They were too strange, too necessary, too haunted to rest among ordinary folk. Their graves were tucked near crossroads, river bends, lone stones no one dared move. Not cursed, watched. Offerings were left, even centuries later. A strand of wool, a coin, a feather, not in gratitude, in hope. That if things ever went wrong, she might still be listening. That her blade might still remember how to find the way back. And just when you think all this died with the old gods, there's a story from only a few decades ago. A remote Irish village. No hospital. One doctor, half blind. A young woman went into labour early. Too early. The father panicked. The roads were flooded. The phones were down. So someone said it. Go wake her. Her, meaning the old one in the woods. No one had seen her in years. Thought she'd gone mad or vanished. But they knocked. And she opened the door with her braid intact. She didn't speak. Just nodded. Took her pouch. Walked through the storm like the wind feared her. Delivered the baby. Saved the mother. Cut the cord with a blade so old it had no shine left. Just presence. When it was over, she left without a word. No thanks, no payment. Just a single strand of hair she plucked from her braid and placed in the baby's hand. It turned grey by morning. They never saw her again. Let's go back to the soul skin. Because what no one tells you is how it itches, how it tightens when a lie is told nearby, how it trembles at the sound of a death that hasn't happened yet. Midwives didn't just carry knowledge, they absorbed it, breathed it in, held it in the soft place beneath their ribs. That's why they aged so strangely. Some looked ancient by 30, others stayed child-faced until their last breath. It had nothing to do with time, everything to do with burden. One midwife had seen so many deaths, she forgot how to speak in anything but questions. Is it turning? Will she bleed? Do you hear the other cry? She asked, even when no one answered. As if the world owed her explanation, as if the blade kept demanding more clarity than life could provide. And it did. The blade, you see, wasn't silent. It tested. Each cut weighed against past ones. Each life saved balanced on a ledger no one could read, except perhaps the spirits. And if too many lines were drawn in the wrong direction, if too much mercy, too much hesitation, too much favouring the wrong fate, well, the blade would begin to bite back. A tremble, a scar that wouldn't close, a voice lost mid-chant. The punishment wasn't death, it was doubt. Midwives feared that more than any wound, because once doubt crept in, once the hands questioned themselves, the threshold became porous, and through that crack, anything could slip. Grief, madness, or worse, the wrong soul. Yes, that was a fear too, that sometimes the baby who cried wasn't the one meant to live, that a switch had happened, a twist of fate uncut, and the midwife, she would carry that mistake, braid it into her hair, let it rest against the steel, not as punishment, but as penance, a reminder, even the blade can't see everything, because no tool, no matter how sacred, is immune to the cruelty of chance. The midwives knew that better than anyone. They didn't believe in perfection, only in effort, only in presence. You showed up, you braided tight, you hummed the bones still, and you cut when cutting was mercy. But sometimes, even that wasn't enough. Sometimes, you watched the light drain from a newborn's eyes, and had to pretend it was nature, even when something inside you whispered otherwise. Let's talk about that whisper. It didn't come from spirits. It wasn't the gods. It wasn't even memory. It was guilt, raw and shapeless, curling itself around the midwife's ribs like ivy through stone. Not because she failed, but because she couldn't know. Because in that crucial moment, when breath and blood and blade all met at once, there was no God beside her. Only instinct, only noise, only silence. And that's when the chant started to crack. There's a line in one of the oldest birthing songs, sung so softly, most barely noticed. If the first breath lies, don't let the second rise. Harsh, isn't it? But that was the line between birth and becoming. Some children were born wrong, not malformed, but misplaced. Their cries too hollow, their skin too cold, their gaze too knowing. Midwives called them borrowed, as in borrowed from elsewhere, meant to go back, but sometimes they stayed. And just when you think that's just metaphor, there's the story of the boy who spoke in a voice older than his father by the time he turned 3. Not precocious, impossible. He knew names no one had told him, knew where the dead were buried, knew how the midwife who delivered him had once hidden a stillborn twin under the hearth to save a grieving mother from despair. He said that twins spoke to him in dreams. No one dared confirm the story, but the midwife. She packed her things the next morning, cut her braid, burned it, buried her blade in the roots of a dying oak, walked into the woods, and was never seen again. Because knowing is dangerous, but being known, that's fatal. Let's go back a bit, to the moment right after the cord was cut, the child placed in arms, the mother weeping, the blood still wet. There was a ritual then, almost forgotten now, called the breath count. The midwife would hold the baby against her chest, not to warm it, but to listen, count the first 12 breaths. 12 was the sacred number, the cycle, the gates. If a breath came too slow, too fast, or not at all, the decision had to be made. Cut again, not the child, the cord, spiritually, to sever whatever tether held it here unnaturally. It was said that if this second cut was done properly, the soul could return to where it belonged. But if done poorly, if the blade hesitated, the child would live a life split in two. Half here, half somewhere else, neither whole. There was one village that banned the breath count, said it was too pagan, too grim, too close to murder. They stopped training their midwives in it, declared it obsolete, cleaned their berths up with linens and Latin and letters of certification. For a while it worked, then came the year of the waking sickness, dozens of newborns, all fine at first. Then hours after birth, they'd scream, not cry, scream, as if something had caught up with them, something that had followed them in. They'd thrash, foam, bite. Mothers went mad from the sounds. Fathers drowned themselves. And the midwives? Powerless. Until one woman came from the coast, old, braid to her hips, blade in her boot. Said nothing, took one look at a newborn mid-scream and whispered, "You left the door open." Then she cut the air, hummed, waited, and silence fell. The baby blinked and slept. The door, it seemed, had been closed, but not without a price, because every door, once shut, echoes. It leaves behind a pressure, a coldness that sticks in the lungs. And the midwife from the coast, she didn't stay. She never asked for thanks. Just touched the child's cheek, nodded once and left before sunrise. But the mothers who watched her go said the air around her shimmered like heat on stone, and that the crows stopped calling when she passed. For 3 days, the village was silent. Then came the dream. Dozens of women, old and young, mothers and daughters, woke at the same hour, choking on seawater that wasn't there. All of them saw the same thing, a braid unravelling underwater, strands drifting like kelp, and at the end of it, a blade gleaming beneath the waves, not rusted, not lost, waiting. And when they tried to tell the men, the priests, the new nurses, they were told it was stress, hormones, superstition. So they formed a circle, unofficial, unnamed, no rituals, just a silent agreement that if another door opened, they'd be the ones to close it. They began to train, not in the ways of textbooks, but in the old ways, passed in fragments, through lullabies, gestures, breath patterns. One learned to hum in such a way that infants calmed instantly. Another could predict bleeding from the scent of the wind. None called themselves midwives, but the braid returned, first thin, then thicker. And just when you think this is some romantic revival, one of them disappeared. No warning, no note, just gone. Her home left undisturbed, but her braid left behind on the hearthstone, unravelled, burnt at the ends. And worst of all, her blade was missing, not buried, taken, which meant one thing no one wanted to say out loud. Someone had stolen the threshold, because that's what the blade was, a fixed point, an anchor in the storm, and without it, births could go wrong in ways no one had words for. Things could slip through. Not spirits, not ghosts. Things. They had no names, only feelings. Midwives never described them directly, but they spoke in symbols. Knots tied too tightly, milk that turned sour on contact, mirrors that stopped reflecting faces after certain deliveries. And now, the stolen blade had no anchor. Let's talk about what happens when a blade chooses the wrong hand. Because it doesn't become dull, it becomes hungry. The wrong bearer doesn't hum. They don't bless. They cut for curiosity, for power. They open doors instead of closing them, and every life touched by that blade becomes unstable. Not cursed, just off. Children who never blink. Mothers who forget their own names. A silence in the birthing room so loud it crushes the ears. One woman, an old student who once trained under the last true midwife, tracked the rumours, followed the symbols, found places where the soil wouldn't grow, where babies didn't cry, where fathers stared blankly into wells, like something was still climbing out of them. She kept her own blade close, tied behind her knee, oiled with ash and tears. But even that began to quiver, because blades can sense each other, especially when their work is being twisted. She reached a village with no name, found a house too clean, too quiet. Inside, herbs hung upside down, not to dry but as barriers. The smell of iron was so thick she gagged, and in the centre, a girl, braid tight, eyes calm, and on her lap, the stolen blade, not gleaming, breathing. The girl smiled and said only one word, "Trade." The midwife turned and walked away. Not out of fear, out of knowledge, because once a blade asks for trade, it's already made its choice. And some doors, once opened, aren't meant to be closed by human hands, not anymore. But that wasn't even the worst part. She returned to her village and found every mirror covered, every baby silent, every hearth cold, and the air, it reeked of salt and something sharper, steel. That's how she knew. The blade had been there, not swung, not waved, just present. And that alone was enough to strip warmth from the hearth, sound from the cradles, reflection from the glass. She didn't weep, didn't scream, just walked the village, braid unravelling with every step, fingers brushing doorposts like she could still push something closed. But there were no doors left, only openings, and openings meant choices, hers or someone else's. So she did what only the oldest midwives dared. She called the gathering, not a meeting, not a council, a summoning, of those who still carried blades in silence, who had kept the songs hidden in tea rituals and thread patterns, who buried their scars under long skirts and longer memories. No names were used, no words spoken, just signs. A tuft of lamb's wool hung on a west-facing tree, a 13th candle lit at dusk, a black ribbon worn on the ankle, and they came, 17 in total. From sea cliffs, bog edges, forest pockets, some walked, one limped, another came carried on a cot by two girls who'd never witnessed death and were about to understand it far too well. The oldest among them didn't even speak. She just took out her blade and laid it on the earth, dull from disuse, but still humming. The message was clear. If the door was open, then they would become the door. Let's talk about the gathering's rules. There are only 3, ancient, unwritten, unbroken, until now. 1. No man may witness. 2. No truth may be written. 3. No blade may strike another. The third was hardest, because the stolen blade had broken covenant. It had chosen violence, not mercy, vanity, not vigilance, and yet blades were not meant to fight each other. They were meant to balance, reflect, close, not cleave. But this wasn't about the blades anymore. This was about the space between them. A rift had opened, thin at first, invisible even. But now, children stared too long into corners. Dogs barked at hearths, milk soured while still inside the cow. Women bled in dreams. And always, that smell. Salt and iron, like the ocean had been boiled in a forge. They camped in silence, 17 midwives, braid bound, blade touched. They didn't speak of plans. They shared meals of root and broth, and sat around a fire that crackled with more than wood. The smoke rose straight, even in wind. Each woman touched the flame before eating. Each sang a line of a lullaby never heard in full. And on the third night, the girl came. The one with the stolen blade, not sneaking, not ashamed. She walked into the firelight as if she belonged there, eyes steady, braid perfect, but the hum around her wasn't song. It was hunger. And in her hand, the blade didn't gleam. It throbbed. She said nothing, just knelt and placed it at their feet. Let's pause there, because that should have been a victory, a surrender. But midwives know better than to trust simple endings. The blade had returned, yes, but not unchanged. It had tasted too much, passed through too many hands, opened doors that could not be closed by ritual or salt. It didn't hum anymore. It growled. The oldest midwife, her mouth sewn shut years ago to keep in secrets, reached forward, touched it, and recoiled. Not from pain, from memory, the kind that comes from another life, another birth, another choice. And just when you think you've heard the worst, the girl opened her mouth. And what came out was not her voice. It was a baby's cry, new, wet, wailing. But not from pain, from hunger, not for milk, but for entry. And suddenly the fire went out. Not with wind, not with water, with silence. A vacuum of heat, light, and sound so complete that the crackling logs seemed to vanish mid-burn. The cry continued, echoing from the girl's throat in impossible waves. Too loud for her lungs, too old for her age, it shook the bones of every midwife present, rattled the blades in their braids, made the trees bend away like they were ashamed to watch. They didn't run. Midwives never run. They anchor. One by one they rose, formed a circle. The girl stayed on her knees, mouth wide, braid unmoving, and that wail pouring from her like a reversed birth. The oldest midwife took her blade and sliced the earth at her feet. Not a wound, a mark, an offering. Then another did the same, and another, until the circle was sealed, not to trap the girl, but to contain what she had become. Let's talk about possession. Not the kind priests warn of, not the head-spinning, curse-muttering nonsense of pulp tales. The real kind, the slow kind, the kind that begins with borrowed breath, with a blink too long, a hunger that's not yours. It doesn't roar in, it settles, learns you, slides its fingers around your spine and waits for you to forget where you end. The blade had done this, not intentionally, not maliciously, but by being held with want instead of reverence. It had become a channel instead of a tool. A tunnel, not a torch. Something had seen through, something hungry, and once fed, it didn't leave. The girl wasn't possessed, she was gestating, and just when you think there's still hope to save her, her braid began to uncoil, not fall apart, uncoil, like a serpent. The strands twisted unnaturally, slower than gravity, faster than time. Each loosened lock revealed darkened scalp beneath, not black with rot but shadow, moving shadow, like something pressing from the inside, eager to emerge. The wailing stopped, the girl collapsed, and then the blade floated. Yes, floated, rising from the ground, like pulled by a string, hovering above her heart, spinning so slowly you couldn't tell whether it was motion or anticipation. No wind moved, no breath stirred. The fire remained unlit, and yet every woman in that circle felt the heat return, not from flame, but from decision, because now the blade had offered them a trade. Let's go back a bit. Midwives were never executioners. That was the role they refused to inherit, even when births went wrong, even when mercy demanded a hard hand. They were guided by breath, not judgment. But this wasn't birth, this was emergence, and it was coming through the wrong door. The youngest of them stepped forward. She hadn't spoken all gathering, hadn't unsheathed her blade, hadn't even braided her hair, just kept it wrapped in linen, untouched, unsworn. But now she let it fall, long, wild, coarse, and from inside that linen wrap she pulled her blade, not iron, not bronze, glass. sharp as grief. The older ones gasped. Glass blades were forbidden, not because they broke, but because they remembered. Each cut made a record, each life touched left a mark. You couldn't hide your past with a blade like that. She stepped into the circle, reached down, and sliced the air above the girl's chest, not deep, not to wound, to redirect, like severing an umbilical cord between planes. And the blade, the floating one, screamed. A sound that had no sound, only pressure, like the collapse of a star. The girl arched, gasped, and finally breathed her own breath. But something else had come through. It wasn't visible, but every midwife felt it. An absence, a lack, like a scream swallowed mid-note. And in that empty space the youngest whispered, "It didn't go back." That whisper was worse than a scream. Because screams end, whispers echo, they crawl. And that sentence, so simple, so calm, moved through the gathered midwives, like smoke through a funeral veil. It didn't go back. Meaning, it's still here. Not dead, not banished, just unmoored. Something that had never been born, now unbound by the rules of flesh, free to roam a world it had no business entering. And it was their fault. Because every tradition broken, every blade misused, every chant forgotten, those weren't harmless losses. They were openings, weak spots in the fabric. And now, something had slipped through. Not in shadow, not in secret, in full view, through a girl's braid and an ancient blade and a moment of misjudged silence. Let's talk about containment. Midwives never believed in destroying, only in holding, cradling what was dangerous, naming it, wrapping it in meaning like a newborn in linen. But this thing, it had no name, no lineage, no breath, just presence. The air shifted wherever it passed. Fire leaned away. Metal grew cold. The smell, salt and steel and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit hidden in a cradle. They called it the hollowing. Not because it was hollow, but because you became hollow near it. Thoughts unravelled, eyes blurred, even memories faded. One of the women forgot her own child's face. Another couldn't remember the sound of her own name. And still they stood. Midwives don't run, they anchor. But how do you anchor a void? And just when it seemed like they might fail, the girl stood. Unaided, pale, dry-eyed. Her braid now limp, like something had been wrung from it. But her blade, the stolen one, remained suspended. And this time, it hovered above her shadow. That's when they knew. It hadn't left. It had nested. The youngest midwife, the one with the glass blade, spoke again. "It's inside the echo," she said. "Not in her, not in us, in what we remember wrong." No one understood at first, but then the oldest nodded, pointed to the fire, now relit but flickering strangely. The flames bent in impossible rhythms, like they were burning a timeline, not wood. Let's go back a bit. There were stories of old, so old they predated speech, about beings that lived between truths, parasites of perception. They didn't eat flesh, they ate certainty, made you question what you knew, what you saw, what you were, and once enough doubt took root, they hollowed you out, left you a shell, not dead, not mad, just husked. And now it had chosen memory as its cradle, which meant fighting it required remembering what never was. A chant never sung, a cut never made, a birth undone. The circle formed again. This time not to close the door, but to rewrite the threshold. Each midwife offered a memory. Out loud, raw, terrible. One spoke of a child she let die because the mother was too tired to try. Another confessed to loving a man who beat her, just to learn pain before teaching healing. One admitted she'd cut a mother to save a baby she knew wouldn't live. All truths. Then the youngest stepped forward and said, "I don't remember my first birth." Silence. "I don't remember if I helped or harmed. I just remember the smell. Burned sage and boiled blood, and then nothing." What if that's when it came through? The blade twitched. Because memory's a doorway too. They laid her down gently. Not to sacrifice, to anchor. They braided her hair with all their blades, 17 strands of iron, bronze, bone, obsidian and glass. each one humming, binding, holding, and as the final knot was tied, the air snapped. A scream, but reversed like something being sucked back. The fire flared, the sky shifted, and for a moment, just a blink, every woman saw her own birth. Not from the outside, from within. And when it ended, the girl was breathing, her braid intact, but her eyes were someone else's, not metaphorically, not the way trauma changes you, literally, irises too pale, pupils too wide, lids that blinked in the wrong rhythm, like they were sinking to a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. The girl sat still, breathing soft, head tilted like she was hearing something from far away, and smiling. Not in joy, in recognition. She was seeing someone familiar in a room full of strangers, and that someone wasn't in the circle. It was inside her. Let's be clear, this wasn't possession. This was residence, a cohabitation, a sharing of flesh, a lease signed under duress. The entity, the hollowing, the hunger, the whatever it was, hadn't forced its way in. It had been invited. The moment that first blade was stolen, the door opened. But now that it had tasted life, it wasn't content to be a whisper. It wanted a voice, eyes, hands, choices, and now it had all of them. The midwives didn't panic. They couldn't afford it. Panic meant rupture. Rupture meant openings, and too many of those had already occurred. Instead, they shifted stance, tightened the circle, let the braid around the girl's body pulse. The blades didn't glow, they resisted. You could hear it, like metal teeth grinding against memory. The youngest spoke first. "What's your name?" the girl answered. But it wasn't speech, it was sound. All of them heard something different. One heard her dead sister's lullaby. Another heard the wail of a mother dying in childbirth. Another heard her own voice begging not to be the one to cut. It wasn't a name. It was pain, personalised. And the girl, she smiled wider. That was the second twist. It knew them. It had tasted their memories through the blades. Absorbed regrets, second guesses, abandoned rituals. It was made not of malice, but of remnants. All the things left unsaid in birthrooms, all the silences, all the avoided truths. It fed on avoidance. And just when the circle began to tremble, the oldest midwife moved. She hadn't spoken in years, hadn't even breathed loudly. But now she took her blade, an obsidian shard older than any house standing, and pressed it to her own palm. A shallow cut, blood pooled, thick, dark. She smeared it on her tongue. Then she sang. Not a chant, a confession. A story about a baby born without a mouth who screamed anyway. About a father who tried to drown his grief in milk. About a storm that wouldn't end until someone sacrificed not a life, but a truth. The girl stopped smiling, because truth is poison to the hollow. The others joined in. Each midwife took their blade. Each made a cut. Each told a truth. Small or massive, it didn't matter. One admitted she never wanted to be a midwife. Another confessed to feeling nothing when her own daughter died. Another had once whispered a lie to a dying mother. It's a boy, when it wasn't. Every story added weight to the air. Not sorrow, substance. The hollowing couldn't breathe, and that's when the glass blade moved again. It hadn't been touched. It acted on its own. Lifted from the earth, hovered above the girl's chest, then spun once, fast, and pointed down. Not as a threat, as a choice. The youngest midwife knelt. "Do we let it stay?" she whispered. And the girl, eyes still foreign, but face softening, shook her head. "No," she said. But this time, it was her voice. Real, cracked, human. So they cut again. This time, not to harm, not to banish, to deliver. The blade sliced air, not skin. It severed the contract, unwound the braid. The presence fled, not in rage, but in reluctance, like it was leaving a feast half-eaten. The girl collapsed. This time, she wept. Real tears, real grief. And finally her eyes returned. Familiar, soft, mortal. But something else had changed. The youngest midwife looked down, and the glass blade, it was cracked, not shattered, not destroyed, just a single jagged line down its translucent belly, like a scar through ice. Beautiful, terrifying, The youngest midwife held it like it was breathing, like it might cough. That kind of break wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The blade had done what no blade was meant to do. Not cut flesh, not guard birth, but divide reality. It had cleaved the seen from the unseen, and now it bore the weight of that fracture. She didn't cry. She pressed the blade to her forehead, where a braid would one day grow, and whispered something so old no one recognised the language. Not even the oldest midwife, but the earth responded. A pulse, faint, like the ground beneath them had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Let's talk about aftermath. You'd think the horror ends when the monster leaves. That silence means peace, that tears mean healing. But no, midwives know better. What comes after is not relief, it's reckoning. The circle broke, slowly. One by one they stepped back into their own bodies, their own thoughts, their own timelines, and that's when the forgetting began. Names slipped, faces blurred. One midwife forgot why she'd braided her blade with red thread. Another couldn't remember which village she came from. The stories they'd shared, those raw confessions, started to unravel. Because truth offered too fast becomes acid. You have to let it sink, let it root. But the girl, she remembered everything. Every scream, every silence, every breath that wasn't hers. She curled by the fire, knees drawn up, whispering fragments of other voices. Not in madness, in mourning. She had carried something not meant to be carried, hosted a hunger that left nothing behind but awareness. And just when they thought the worst was over, the stars blinked. Not all of them, just a few. Faint pulses in the sky, like someone had briefly pressed a thumb against the heavens. One midwife looked up and whispered, "It's marking us," another nodded. "It knows who cut, who saw, who sang." Because nothing crosses the threshold without remembering the doorkeepers. They returned to their villages in silence. No chants, no songs. Just the feel of iron in their braids and the absence of something they'd never named. Some gave up midwifery, others leaned in harder. Wiser, sharper, haunted. The oldest midwife disappeared within days, not vanished, withdrawn. Like a tide that had gone out and decided never to return. And then came the births, not monstrous, not cursed, but strange. One baby blinked sideways, another had 2 heartbeats, another didn't cry until its 3rd day, and when it did, the sound cracked glass across the room. None were evil, but none were untouched. The hollowing hadn't left a scar, it had left seeds. The youngest midwife took no more apprentices. She wandered, from village to grove to cliffside to bog, teaching only through glances, through touch, through the kinds of stories that end before they begin. Her blade she carried always, cracked, wrapped in cloth, humming less now, but humming nonetheless. She was marked, not as saviour, not as sinner, as witness, because that's the true role of a midwife, not to deliver life, to witness the passage, to see when something should not pass. Let's go back a bit, to the first time a blade was braided into hair, not as ornament, not as weapon, but as reminder that birth was never clean, that some spirits don't want to leave and some come through wrong, that the edge between worlds is not guarded by priests or kings or chants, but by a woman, on her knees, singing through tears, blade humming, hair woven, breath held, and when the time comes, she doesn't ask permission. She cuts, but who cuts the cutter? That question wasn't written in their chants. It wasn't carved into stone or whispered at births, but it lingered, in firelight, in the pause before a scream, in the quiet after something impossible slipped into the world and left a midwife changed. The youngest, now no longer the youngest, walked with that question buried behind her eyes, and the cracked blade at her hip never stopped humming. Let's talk about hums. Not all blades sing, only the ones that remember. Some hum in warning, others in longing. The cracked glass blade, it hummed in grief. It had been used to sever something unspeakable, to hold back a hunger older than myth, and now it vibrated with the tension of restraint, like it knew it would never cut again, not because it was broken, but because it shouldn't. The midwife carried it anyway, because sometimes the thing that can't be used is the thing that reminds you why. She came upon a village where women bled too long after birth, not enough to die, just enough to forget their own names. The men blamed the moon, the priests blamed sin, but the midwife saw it immediately. The braids, all unbound, all loose, not a single blade woven in. She asked why. The women shrugged. "It makes them nervous," one said, nodding toward the men. "Says it makes us look like witches." The midwife didn't flinch. She pulled her hair free, slow and deliberate, unwrapped the cloth. Let the cracked blade catch the firelight. Then, in full view of everyone, she wove it into her braid. 1 loop, 2, 3. The room held its breath. And the humming? It stopped. Because the blade knew where it belonged. Let's go back a bit. There was a ritual once, long buried, reserved only for midwives who had cut the veil more than thrice. It wasn't performed often, because surviving 3 threshold births was rare. But when it happened, they were given a new name, not a title, a sound, not to be spoken, only felt. A hum in the bones, the kind of sound that made birds quiet and flames steady. She earned that sound, not through victory, through witnessing. Because some things you don't survive, you absorb. And the hollowing? It hadn't left her. It had circled her, orbiting like a planet without gravity. She knew it was still looking, not for re-entry, for acknowledgement. It wanted to be known. And just when she thought she could forget it, a woman came, pregnant, alone, bleeding from somewhere she shouldn't. Eyes too wide, mouth stitched with silence, not thread, but fear. The villagers said she wandered in from the forest, that she didn't speak, that her shadow arrived before her. The midwife asked no questions. She laid her down. Boiled water lit the herbs, but the blade, it began to hum again. Low, reluctant, like it didn't want to remember. The woman screamed, but not in labour, in echoes, sounds she shouldn't know, screams from other wombs, other eras. One midwife recognised her own mother's death wail. Another felt her unborn child kick for the first time, though she'd miscarried years ago. The air twisted, the room spun, reality wrinkled, and in the centre, the midwife stood still. She unbraided the blade, laid it flat, and refused to cut, because this wasn't a birth, it was an entry, and some entries must remain unassisted. The woman stopped screaming. She opened her eyes, and they were her own. The hollowing hadn't found a host, it had found a doorway, and been denied, again. But the cost? The blade cracked further. Hairline, subtle, but real. The midwife rewrapped it, and this time, when she braided her hair, she left the blade out. Not because she was afraid, not because she was done, but because some truths are too sharp to carry every day. The blade had cracked once for memory, twice for denial, a third time, and it would not just break, it would shatter. And if it shattered, it wouldn't just die. It would release everything it had held back. Every cry swallowed, every birth twisted, every hunger still circling, waiting for a second chance. So she tucked it away, wrapped in lambskin, buried beneath the roots of an ash tree. No chance, no markings, just a single strand of her own hair, tied around the bundle. A token, a tether. If the hollowing returned, she'd know where to dig. But until then, she would walk unarmed, vulnerable, honest. Let's talk about unarmed midwives. It's rare. Blades weren't just for show or shadow play. They were tools of presence, of refusal, of protection, not just from spirits, but from people. Men who barged into birthing rooms with accusations, old women drunk on power and salt, grief-heavy mothers desperate to blame. A blade in the braid meant, I see you, I won't flinch. But now she bore only her name, no hum, no echo, and that made people nervous. In her next village, they called her the Whisper, not because she spoke quietly, but because her presence made the air behave. Fires burned lower. Animals paused mid-graze. Even wind chose a longer route. She arrived without ceremony, slept near the goats, ate what was offered, and waited. It didn't take long. The girl was barely 15. First birth. Too early. The midwife knew before the first cry that the baby wouldn't stay. Not because of any curse, because the world doesn't always say yes. Some souls try the door, hear what's inside, and walk away. But the mother didn't understand that. She screamed, not from pain, but betrayal. "They said you were a witch," she sobbed, legs trembling in bloodied straw. "That you could stop this?" The midwife didn't argue. She just laid her hand on the girl's thigh, whispered an apology to the soul retreating through the womb, and watched it go. She didn't close the baby's eyes because they'd never opened, and just when the room seemed like it might fracture under grief, she sang. Not a lullaby, not a prayer, a name, not for the baby, for the absence. She named the leaving, because that's what blades used to do. Before they cut, they named what was here, what was missing, what must not cross. And for the first time in her journey, she used only voice. No steel, no glass, just breath and will. Let's go back a bit. Before blades, there were bones. Midwives wore teeth of the dead, claws of hunted beasts, antlers of fallen stags. Not trophies, testimonies. Proof that they'd stood at the brink and returned. But even then, some midwives chose nothing. They walked barefoot into births, marked only by scars and the way dogs refused to bark around them. They were feared. They were respected. They were listened to. She became that. Without trying, without wanting, just by showing up again and again when others turned away. When blood flowed in wrong directions, when shadows curled too tightly around cradles, when screams came from places that weren't mouths. She didn't cut, she held, and that made her dangerous, because if she could face the hollowing without steel, what else might she survive? The cracked blade slept beneath the ash, but it wasn't forgotten. It pulsed, not in urgency, in readiness, for the day she would need to braid it back into her hair, for the birth that wouldn't be a birth, for the whisper that became a roar. But for now, she walked, unarmed and unafraid, until the day she wasn't. Because fear doesn't arrive with trumpets or fire. It doesn't crash in with claws. It seeps, drips, waits. And when it finds a crack, especially in someone who's worked so hard to seal herself shut, it spreads like ink in water. She felt it first in her knees, a wobble that wasn't fatigue, then in her breath, too shallow, too soon, and finally in her dreams. Let's talk about dreams. The ones she had now weren't nightmares. They were repeats, not visions of what could go wrong, but replays of what had already happened, warped into riddles. The girl with the unblinking eyes, the child who cried in reverse, the cracked blade, the ash tree, over and over, like someone was teaching her through dissonance. One night, she dreamed she was the baby. Not a baby. The baby. The one who never opened its eyes. In the dream, she floated inside a womb of ash and honey, listening to midwives cry just outside her skin. She felt their regret, their guilt, their secret relief. And then, without breath, without warning, she chose not to be born. But she remembered everything. Woke up gasping, covered in dew, her braid undone. And just when she thought it was only her, the ash tree was bleeding. Not sap, blood. Thick, black, slow. The earth around it had shifted. Not dug up, swollen. Something inside had grown restless. Not the blade, the silence around it. She knew immediately. The hollowing hadn't been buried. It had been fed. By stories, by breath, by every word she told and every truth she unearthed. It had been listening, growing, adapting. Let's go back a bit. The hollowing never wanted destruction. It wasn't fire, it wasn't rage, it was absence. It didn't kill, it erased. And if you weren't careful, it erased in ways you didn't notice until it was too late. The name of a plant, the direction of a chant, the exact number of cuts a ritual needed. Tiny vanishings. But when enough vanishings collect, you lose structure. And that's when it returns. The midwife dug fast, hands raw, nails broken, no tools. Just desperation. and a hum growing louder beneath the soil. When her fingers finally brushed lambskin, it burned her. Not physically, metaphysically, like her future had been cursed. She unwrapped the blade. It was humming, audibly, the crack now a fissure, widened, thirsty, and as she lifted it to the moonlight, she saw something reflected not in the blade, but in her shadow. It was moving, out of sync, a beat late, a breath too long. She wasn't alone in herself anymore. She couldn't run. She couldn't scream. She braided, fingers shaking. She wove the blade into her hair like a forgotten prayer. Twist, loop, bind. The moment the final lock sealed, the hum stopped, and the shadow froze. But something darker was coming. The village on the other side of the ridge had gone silent. No fires, no smoke, no midwives, just empty homes and blood trails shaped like questions. She walked in slowly, blade humming again, now in rhythm with her pulse. In one home, she found a child, alive, unblinking, silent. She knelt, reached for the child's face, and in that moment, the child exhaled, but the breath wasn't theirs. It smelled of ash and absence, and her cracked blade shattered. Right there, in her braid, not exploded, not splintered, it dissolved. 1 second, a tangible shard of memory braided against her scalp. The next, dust, grey, fine, cold. It didn't scatter, it settled, coating her shoulders, her lips, the child's face. A burial not of body but of boundary. She couldn't move, not from fear, from comprehension. She had just lost her last protection, and whatever breathed through that child's nose was already inside the walls. The child blinked, once, twice, and then smiled. Not sweetly, not cruelly, but with the ease of something that had waited a long time to be seen. The midwife staggered back, dust still clinging, bladeless, unmoored. That was the fourth twist. It had never been about the blade. The hollowing wasn't sealed by steel. It was distracted by it, obsessed, drawn to it like a mirror. And while midwives had been braiding iron into their hair and trusting its hum to guard them, they'd been feeding it, offering presence, ritual, rhythm, all the things it lacked. Until now, it had learned them. She didn't run, but her breath turned brittle. The village behind her, empty. The child before her, watching. The dust on her skin, humming now, low, invasive. Let's go back a bit. When midwives were trained, not in schools but in silence, they were warned about this, not directly, through stories, fables. One tale told of a midwife who delivered a baby that breathed backwards. She thought it was cursed, tried to smother it, but each time she pressed down, she lost a year of her own life. By the time the child died, she was 93 and screaming in a voice that belonged to someone else. Moral? Don't fight the mystery. But also, never name it, because naming gives it spine. The child spoke. You're her. 3 words. Flat, soft, final. The voice wasn't gendered. It wasn't childlike. It was tuned, measured to her bones. It resonated in her teeth, echoed in her ribs, and landed in the hollow just beneath her heart. The midwife whispered. Whose? The child blinked again. Mine. She should have left. She should have burned the village. She should have buried herself in peat and let the earth forget her name. But instead, she stayed. She lifted the child, no rituals, no songs, and carried them to the ash tree. The tree was different now, blackened at the core, weeping dust. Its roots no longer held the earth. They spread above it, like fingers grasping for something it had forgotten. She laid the child at its base, waited. Wind rose, not from the sky, from the soil, and in it, voices, not screams, choices. Every time she hadn't cut, every soul she'd let go, every time she'd looked the hollowing in the eye and whispered no. Now, those refusals swirled around her like moths made of sound. The child stood, looked up at her. No blade? She shook her head. Good, they said, and stepped into the tree, not behind it, not under it, into it, like a mouth finally opening. The ash closed, silence returned, and the midwife dropped to her knees, not in grief, but in revelation. The hollowing didn't want to destroy, it wanted to belong. It had tried to birth itself through absence, through forgetting, through hunger. But what it craved, what it had mimicked, was a womb. And the child? It had been the first, the only. But something darker was still coming, because now the hollowing had learned how to be born, and that was the last mercy, because once something knows how to arrive, it never asks again. It forces. The air around the ash tree didn't settle. It thickened. Each breath she took became a decision. Stay, flee, collapse, reborn. Every option tasted the same, ash and iron, soaked in old blood. And in that moment, the midwife realised she had finally become what they had always warned her about. Not a guardian, not a vessel, a gate. She stood slowly. Her legs no longer hers, or maybe finally, fully hers. Because there's something about surviving your own myth that makes you weightless. The cracked blade was gone. The ash tree was quiet. But deep inside her gut, she felt the shift. Not a kick, not pain, but presence. The hollowing had entered through the child, but it had stayed with her. Let's talk about possession. Most people think it's loud, violent, heads turning, voices doubling. But this was gentle. This was lullabies where there should be silence, echoes in footsteps, dreams that felt edited. And when she spoke now, her own voice had a second rhythm beneath it. Not harmonizing, shadowing. She didn't resist, because what would she resist? She had been taught to midwife births, not stop them. And now, she was pregnant. Not with flesh, not with soul. With a memory that had never been hers but had waited lifetimes to find a womb that wouldn't reject it. And just when she thought the weight would crush her, she laughed. Not a giggle, not hysteria. A laugh carved from the centre of someone who has finally seen the edge of their story. She looked at the sky, still thick with dusk despite it being morning, and whispered, "Fine, let's see what you become." Then she walked. Not toward a village, but toward the sea. Let's go back a bit. In old chants, the sea was the last refuge for midwives who had seen too much. They weren't mourned. They were remembered in tide patterns, in driftwood shapes, in the cries of seabirds that sometimes echoed like infants. It was said the sea could unbraid any curse so long as you entered willingly, without blade, without name. She had all three, no weapon, no name, only purpose. The beach was empty, the tide low. She knelt, not in prayer, in readiness, and waited. But the hollowing? It did not like the sea. It shuddered in her bones, recoiled, tried to reverse itself, tried to climb back into silence, but it was too late. It had been seen, named, carried, held. And now, even the salt of the ocean couldn't erase its outline. She stood, waded in, waist deep, then chest, then chin. The water was cold, but she was hot, burning from the inside out. Not in fever, in labour, and just when she thought she might drown, she birthed, a breath, a sound, a rupture. The sea didn't boil, it sang, low, ancient, not welcoming, not threatening, just aware. And what came out of her wasn't a child, it was formless, a shape made of memory and hunger and lullabies long stolen. It hovered above the water, then folded in on itself and vanished. Not with a splash, with a decision. Because now the hollowing knew, not just how to be born, but how to choose where and who. She crawled back to shore, empty, not healed, just hollow, and behind her the sea whispered. Not her name, its own. She didn't respond, not because she didn't hear, but because she finally understood the curse of knowing too much, of remembering, of surviving what shouldn't be survivable. It doesn't make you brave, it doesn't make you wise, it just makes you quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't silence, the kind that echoes. She sat at the edge of the shore, hair crusted with salt, and the last breath of something that wasn't quite born and wasn't quite gone. No blade, no chance, no purpose left to braid, just her, just the sea, and the knowledge that something had chosen her, not for her strength, but for her openness. And just when she thought it was over, a woman appeared, young, barefoot, braid heavy with iron. She knelt beside her, didn't speak, didn't ask. She unwrapped a bundle from her satchel, small, worn, wrapped in fur. She unrolled it slowly, reverently. Inside a shard of the blade. The midwife stared. It hadn't shattered completely. A fragment survived, still humming, still waiting. The young woman placed it in the elder's lap, then turned to go. No words, because what could she say to someone who had birthed the hollowing into the sea? She walked away, back toward the tree line, but her braid swung heavy with sharpness, with readiness. Let's go back a bit. Once a dying midwife whispered to her apprentice, "We don't stop it, we pace it, buy time, delay the forgetting, keep the gates confused." And when the apprentice asked what happens when the blade breaks, the elder just smiled. "Then you become the blade." Now, sitting on that sand, brittle and hollow, she finally understood. She had been the steel, the cut, the severance, not to kill, to mark. She picked up the shard, turned it in her fingers. It didn't hum, it pulsed, and with each pulse she remembered. Not the horrors, but the details. The soft cries, the soil-warmed blood, the rhythm of ancient lullabies sung not to calm, but to warn. She stood, slowly. Her knees cracked, her breath came ragged, but her eyes, clear. She didn't return to the ash tree, or the village, or the child. She walked inland, toward the mountains, because stories move in circles, and somewhere beyond the fog, another child would come, another mother would scream, and something else would wait behind her shadow. Let's talk about endings. They're lies. Every midwife knows that. There's no end to pain, no end to birth, no end to the choices that ripple through bone and blood and breath. There's just the next scream, the next cut, the next forgetting, and in those moments, if you're lucky, someone will be there. Hair braided, blade hidden, hands steady, voice quiet, watching, waiting, ready not to fight what comes, but to witness it, to carry the memory forward like a wound that sings. And so the final image is this: a figure in the mist, hair greying, skin scarred, eyes that have seen what should not be seen and chosen, anyway, to return. No blade, no hum, just the sound of footsteps and a whisper behind them. If they don't know we're coming, they'll never know what hit them. So what does that say about us? That even in myth we prefer the midwife to the monster? Or that we still can't tell the difference?